Hey everybody, welcome to Vacuum Wars. It's been a little while since I've done a review on air purifiers, and I thought the best way to get back into it would be to do a competition video where I compare 3 unlikely competitors. The first one is one of, if not the most expensive home air purifier on the market, the IQair Healthpro Plus. The second is the much cheaper Levoit Core 300, which is consistently #1 on the best seller lists. And finally, a DIY air purifier, which is basically a box fan with a HEPA filter strapped to it. I put all 3 through a number of tests this week, and the results were pretty interesting. So, links in the description to everything I'll mention, and let's get started. Now, you should know that in some ways this is a totally unfair competition. The IQair Healthpro Plus is just a better air purifier than the other 2 in most ways, which is what you would expect considering you could buy like 9 Levoit Core 300s for one IQair. But the purpose of this video is to explain what the differences are and to see if it's worth spending that extra money in your situation, because I suspect that for some people the Levoit or even the box fan concept is all that you'll need, but that's what we're here to find out. Let me start off by describing each one of these air purifiers, and I should say that I bought all these myself and am not sponsored by any of these companies in any way. The IQair Healthpro series is considered, I think, to be one of the best air purifier lines on the market. It's built using a kind of stacking system for the filter modules. The one I'm using, the Plus, has 2 huge particle filters. A pre-filter on the bottom, which traps coarse particles like pollen, pet dander, and mold spores, and the HEPA filter on the top, which IQair designed themselves. They call it a hyper HEPA system and claim that it can trap particles down to 0.003 microns, which is 100 times smaller than the best HEPA filters I'm used to seeing on vacuums, which means it's effective with ultra-fine particles like viruses and other really tiny things. But the big difference to me is the absolutely massive activated carbon module. They call it the V5 cell. This is what absorbs odors, gases, chemicals, and volatile organic compounds like formaldehyde. This feature is the secret behind what I consider to be the best demo of a product I've ever seen, where the CEO of IQair went into a sealed room that was filled with tear gas, just breathing the air that was filtered by the IQair. Just a classic demo. The Levoit Core 300 comes in either black or white, and as I said earlier, has consistently been the #1 bestseller online from everything I can tell. It's about 8 times cheaper than the IQair and a lot smaller. It also has a HEPA filter, but just a standard HEPA filter that filters particles down to 0.3 microns. The Levoit also has an activated carbon layer on the interior of the filter, and while I don't know anything about the quality of activated carbon, I can speak to the quantity, and I would guess there's about 20 or 30 times more activated media in the IQair filter than in the Levoit. You can also buy specialized filters for the Levoit, like for smoke or ones that are more geared towards VOCs, but the one I'll be testing is the original, which is a HEPA filter with a small amount of activated carbon and a simple mesh pre-filter. Finally, we have the box fan, and there are a ton of tutorials online about DIY air purifiers, and I wanted to give it a fair shot, so I bought 3 different box fans and a lot of different 20 by 20 square filters. These filters are rated based on how good they are, with MERV 13 or FPR 10 being the best, which is roughly equivalent to HEPA filters rated at 0.321 microns. I tested the airflow of the fans, and once I found a winner between the 3, which was the Amazon Basics fan, I tested it with different filter options, eventually choosing the MERV 13 20 by 20 by 2, which is a little thicker than the standard, which gives it better airflow and a longer lifespan. I also like the Amazon Basics fan because it had structural barriers around the edges, which makes it more efficient at pulling the air through the filters. In addition to multiple power levels, the IQair and the Levoit had filter replacement indicators, as well as timed modes and other useful electronic things. The box fan was just a box fan with 3 power level options on a dial. I started off by measuring their airflow, and I should mention here that I think that air purifier companies measure airflow directly at the fan, where I was measuring its airflow after it was processed through the filters. So these numbers should not be considered official specs, but they do at least show a relative difference between the products. I found that the IQair had the most airflow on max power, which is even more impressive when you realize that the IQair has much more filter media to slow the air down. So the fan on the IQair would have a lot higher airflow if you measured it directly. directly, I'm sure. The IQair had 6 power levels, which went down to 24 CFM on low power, where the Levoit and the box fan had 3 power levels, where 38 CFM and 22 CFM were as low as they could go respectively. Another test is where I filled a box with fog from a fog machine for 10 seconds. This is also a speed test of sorts. For a baseline, I filled up the box and left it for 20 minutes, and you can tell it didn't dissipate much at all. Here again, the IQair was the best, at 20 seconds on max power versus 35 seconds on the Levoit and 48 seconds with the box fan, which is 140% slower than the IQair. Also at the studio, I tested their noise level, and this is important because if you have any of these on max power, you're going to be able to hear it. And the IQair was the loudest on max power at 70 decibels, pretty close to the box fan, which was 68 decibels, with the Levoit being the quietest at 58 decibels. Here again, it's important to look at these numbers relative to their power output on max power. Remember, the IQair had double the CFM on max power compared to the Levoit, so a mere 17% difference in noise level is actually pretty good considering. The only loser here is the box fan, which had a pretty dismal airflow to noise level ratio. I did multiple 1-hour max power tests both at the studio and at my house. At the studio, the room I tested is about 360 square feet with relatively high ceilings. At my house, it was more like 1,200 square feet if you include all the rooms on the first floor, also with high ceilings. With this test, I found that the Levoit kept pace with the IQair, especially in the smaller space, but it was pretty close in the larger home test as well, both of them averaging about 90% reduction of the particles in the air in 1 hour. The box fan struggled here with a much lower reduction of particles over an hour, and here again I should reiterate that these tests are a million miles from controlled environments, so take them all with a grain of salt. A much more useful test, in my opinion, is something I think of as the real-world test. This is where I choose the power level that I would use personally, which is mostly based on their noise level, so that would be power level 1 on the Levoit and the box fan, and power level 2 on the IQair, and I let it run overnight to see the level it reduces the air particles in that time. Here I took the 0.3 micron count and the 2.5 micron count and averaged them to get a score where the lower the number is, the better. And here again, I was impressed with the Levoit. Though it wasn't as good as the IQair, it was really close. Again, the box fan was just nowhere near as good. I did try to measure VOCs, but the meter I bought was a new type that I had not used before. It said it took 7 days to calibrate, which I did not have, so I'm not at all sure of the accuracy of these measurements. But in the overnight test, the IQair results were 114 on the meter compared to almost 300 on the Levoit and 428 on the box fan. And of course, the box fan doesn't have any way to reduce VOCs, so I'm guessing that's sort of the baseline. But if those results are anywhere close to accurate, then it's a huge difference of about 161% from the IQair to the Levoit. A few other considerations are the size and weight. The IQair is 16 by 15 by 28, which is like an entire piece of furniture. It's on rollers, but it's pretty heavy too. The Levoit is much smaller and lighter, and in my opinion, a much better looking option, or at least it's easier to hide. The box fan is just a box fan with duct tape on it, so, not the best in terms of presentation. Also, there's the cost of the filters to consider. The IQair filters are much bigger, meaning that they have to be replaced less often. IQair says 4 years on the HEPA filter, 2 years on the V5, and 18 months on the pre-filter. Based on customer reviews with the Levoit, I would say that the average time is 4 months per filter, and about the same with the box fan. Based on some rough estimates, I'd say it's roughly half the cost to operate the Levoit or the box fan versus the IQair. So is the IQair the best air purifier? Yeah, it is, and it's well worth it if you need to make sure that you're getting super fine particles like under 0.3 microns like most viruses, or if you're concerned about volatile organic compounds. But for the money, the Levoit Core 300 holds its own with the IQair, at least with regard to particle reduction at a quick pace. It has some VOC reduction as well, but I wouldn't expect too much out of it in that regard. The box fan was certainly better than nothing, but by the time you buy the fan and the filters, it's not that much cheaper than the Levoit, and it's a lot more inconvenient in my opinion. Links in the description, and be sure to subscribe to Vacuum Wars before you leave. Thanks for watching.